Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Julian and I have been doing some work at Abbey Cwmhir, but I have to say that the discoveries are very much down to Julian and his methodologies and techniques and his expert drone flying, which I admire greatly. Now, we have decided that we'll divide the talk in half, so it'll make a slightly uncomfortable moment when we switch from my screen to Julian's screen, but I hope that won't be too difficult. We agreed that what I would do is to set the new work in a very, very broad context. I know there are one or two specialists in the audience, and I want to ask your forgiveness for what over the next 18 slides will be actually the blindingly obvious. But I thought it would be very useful for people to understand where in a sense, the Abbey Cwmhir precinct is actually coming from. So I want to begin with this first slide, because in a way it will set the tone for monasticism and the enclosed life of the monk and the life and work, particularly of the closed orders, like the Cistercians at Abbey Cwmhir. And I've taken these pictures from a book by one of my heroes, Thomas Merton, the great scholar and theologian, and his book, Silence in Heaven, with these extraordinary black and white photographs in it. And I just wanted to start by saying it is, of course, a life of prayer, aura, and the liturgy, and the serving of the, in the terms of the liturgy, following the rule of St. Benedict, I'll come on to. Lectio, divine reading, often done, as you can see in this picture, in the cloister, and particularly for the Cistercians, a life of labor, of work in the fields, on the estates, within the precinct, can range from manuscript illustration to pickaxing out a ditch for drainage. So I just start, in a sense, with those three principles. Where does monasticism begin? Well, you could go back in time, way beyond Christianity, because in a way, the notion of serving God within a closed community, withdrawing from the world, is something that you will find in many of the world's religions. And I just want to identify for you, as monasticism begins to emerge in the 3rd, 4th centuries in the Holy Land and in Egypt in particular, we are dealing with two great traditions. One, the eremitic tradition, following the teaching of Christ and going into the wilderness to fight one's devils and to establish peace with God and greater understanding and self-awareness. Two great figures in that story early on of St. Jerome and St. Anthony, and very often they sought out on their own cave sites like these cut into the limestones of the Syrian desert in the central picture. And these cave sites often actually became, quite quickly, as the reputations of these hermits grew, sites of pilgrimage, people coming to visit, and so on. So withdrawing from the world became a more and more complex and difficult thing. But that hermit tradition continued. What we're going to be focusing on is the other branch, main branch to monasticism, which is the koinobitic tradition, from the Greek koinos bios, or common life. It's not, in a sense, meeting God, dealing with God, praising God, understanding God in isolation, but within the fabric of a community And one of the things I want to draw attention to first off is that almost from the start, the enclosure of the space of the monastery is highly defined and very, very precise. In this case, as at St. Simeon in Syria, with a high wall, and at Der Siman in Syria, another early site, you have the enclosure. And it's interesting to note at Der Siman how it is that the church, which is 3, I hope you can see my cursor in here, has a courtyard, and arranged around it are pilgrims' hostels. These sites are sites of pilgrimage. People come to visit and to respect the work of the monks. I want just very briefly to draw your attention to a late Roman concept of this world, epitomized in the work of Augustine of Hippo in the early 5th century, talking of the civitas Dei contra paganos, the city of God against the pagans. And it contained within it an important concept which carries all the way through to the present day. And that is the distinction that Augustine makes between the civitas, the city, and the pagus. The civitas is very much the inside space, the bounded space, the space that is sacred and holy. And beyond, in the countryside, the pagus is the French word pays, in the countryside, from which the word paganos, pagan, comes to us, is that beyond the enclosures, outside, is the other. And very often the other is conceived of as the devil. And the idea of inside and outside, I think, is fundamental to grasp when you're looking at somewhere like Abbey Cwmhir. And the space enclosed in this way comes to be known from the Latin as precinct, from the Latin praecingere, which means to encircle. And I'll get some of these basic words across because they have great antiquity and very, very deep meaning. Monasticism begins very much, the Koinobitic tradition begins particularly in Egypt. The site which is often associated with those origins is one called Tabanisi, here down in on the edge of the Egyptian desert, and dispersing from there into the Holy Land, into the Delta, the Nile Delta, and from there dispersing into what later become the Orthodox regions, and then traveling the length of the Mediterranean, particularly to the regions at the base of the Rhone Valley in here, before then dispersal up the Rhone Valley system, particularly to a site like Tours in here, and it is then carried up into the British Isles. The dispersal point in terms of landing, and one of the earliest monastic sites known to us is the island of Légrin, which lies just off the coast of southern France. I looked at this. I very nearly became involved in a project with the French government to study this. It's an extraordinary site that has 6 separate isolated churches all around, 3 or 4 of which are Romanesque, as you can see in this picture. From there, a very important site in terms of the dispersal of Western monasticism is Tours. This is Tours itself at the end of the Roman period. It's a civitas. Its pays today is still the Touraine, and it has the site of the cathedral. The modern cathedral, the medieval cathedral, is on the top of this, but an early cathedral of St. Martin of Tours, who was a very important name in the beginnings of monasticism in Western Europe, and his cathedral here. And he established one of the first monasteries in this region at Marmoutier, just across the river Loire, over here, and the cathedral inside the remains of a Roman, the monastery is inside the remains of a Roman posting station. In other words, they're utilizing an enclosed and fortified space, which is already there in the landscape. And in the history of monasticism throughout Europe, this is very often a common motif. Sorry, I hadn't put this up. I apologize. I was looking at my small version. This is Marmoutier today, found in 372 by St. Martin on the other side of the Loire, on the north bank of the Loire, and his cathedral as Bishop of Tours is inside the original fortification of the city of Tours, the Civitas, in here. And it's very much the connection through Tours which brings us Western monasticism, often called Celtic monasticism. I'm going to try and avoid using that word Celtic tonight, if I can possibly stop myself saying it. And that Western monasticism has many sites which are known to us from the early documents. And this, there are two of them. This is the site of Armagh, the modern city of Armagh, with St. Patrick's Cathedral at the center of it. And you can see, just in this vertical air photograph, the way in which it lies within concentric circles with other churches within the fabric of that circular, embedded, circular enclosures, those nested circular enclosures. And the site of Whithorn up in Dumfries, is also of great interest, known to be the monastery, the great monastery of St. Mungo, one of the early Western monastic saints. And it also lay, an excavation has demonstrated this, within concentric circles. One of the things to note, I think, is the way in which actually the inner circle, although it has churches, chapels, actually is a burial ground in the first instance, something that is interesting me at the moment. There is a curious diagram at the back of the Book of Mulling, the colophon, which appears to demonstrate this nested circularity with sacred sites laid out within it, and indeed just on the periphery of it. I think you can hope you can make out the things like the Cross of Mark, for example, set in key locations. It's quite a remarkable document. But we must always remember that while these Coenobitic monasteries, these communities of monks, are being created within the Western tradition, the Eremitic tradition also continues, and arguably this extraordinary site on a rock in the western, off the western coast of Ireland at Skellig-Mhir, this is arguably an eremitic site, although there appear to be a number of individual beehive structures inside the enclosure. You can see even in these instances there is enclosure, but getting as far away from the world, much solitude as you can possibly acquire. In terms of the early church in Wales, we don't yet have major excavations of a clear major church. But scholars have for many years indicated from the early source documents, and mapped here by William Rees on the right, the sites of the great mother churches, the sites of the major monasteries associated very often with dominant saints within the lives of the saints. Sites like Llanbadarn, Llandewi, Llandeilo, and over in your direction, places like Llandinam, St Harmon, Llangurig. And these sites are identified. If you look at the vertical photograph of Llandeilo here on the left-hand side, you can see, just as at Armagh, the circularity of the site, and at the core of it here, there is a massive cemetery, which is cut by a modern road running through the middle of it, and the church and a holy well site as well. These are the major sites, the so-called classai, the class sites. Then the minor, these seem to have controlled, run minor sites in the landscape, very often these days identified by the Welsh word clan or kill, cell, and these sites have their own archaeology. The one on the left is the site of Julian in Cardiganshire, very close to me here in Lampeter, and we've done a sketch survey, and you can see the church, its cemetery, within an enclosure, nested within a greater outer enclosure, and you can just make out earthworks of structures within that outer enclosure. More work needs to be done here. And here a crop mark site in Carmarthenshire, a bit further west and south at Llanlligan, and the crop marks there show how the later parochial church of the 12th or 13th century has migrated away from the original core, and leaving this crop mark site again of concentric circles are very much like Julian. So there's a strong theme in terms of archaeology, in terms of the expression of this notion of the enclosure of the precinct. The spatial organization of the later class in central Wales is complex. And if you really want to understand this map, buy my book on Strata Florida, History and Landscape of Strata Florida, if you haven't already done so. But what this map does shows one, Llanbadarn Fawr, Llangurig, St Harmon, Llandewi Brefi, for known class sites, and what we know of their territories. This blue is the territory, the parochia, the parish, or territorium of Llanbadarn Fawr, and a number of dependent churches, which are many of them clan sites. And you can do the same for Llangurig in here, which remains a monstrous parish, and St Harmon down in here. Llandewi Brefi, even more complex, it remains as a great manor of St David's into the High Middle Ages. But these green spots here show the places where priests would attend services. They're so-called prebendary priests would attend services at Llandewi Brefi into the 13th and 14th centuries. Curious little outliers like these over here in the Wye Valley as well. The book argues that in fact Strata Florida is based on one of these classes. We think it's underneath the modern, underneath the present archaeology, underneath the Cistercian Abbey, but I'm not going to dwell on that tonight. The major change comes in the monastic reform movement that is taking place between the 8th and 11th centuries in Western Europe, sometimes under the guidance of great princes like Charlemagne, for example. And it is about the introduction and the reaffirmation of the rule of St. Benedict of Nursia, as laid out in the 6th century. And this is the oldest known copy, an 8th century copy, which is in the Bodleian Library. And it sets out the way in which a monk should lead his life and how he should serve God. And at about in the early 9th century, we have surviving in a manuscript, you can just see it in the bottom left-hand corner here, a plan of St. Gall. St. Gall is in Switzerland over here, and it is taken to be the guidance under probably the under the eye of Charlemagne, guidance as to how a reformed monastery should be laid out. At the core of the reformed monastery, if you look at this plan, is the great church and a claustral complex around which are ranged a series of buildings. Compacted in around it are a lot of other buildings which are actually to do with the labor, the work of the monastery, gardens, and so on. And they're all packed together in this plan. The reality is probably that these buildings were rather more dispersed, but the core of it, in particular, is the cloister and the church, which are conceived as paradisum, the paradise of the garden. Again, complex symbols in relationship to this. The blue circles are the Charlemanic, the monasteries, the early monasteries of the Reformed order. It was really Cluny in Burgundy, central Burgundy, that became the driving force of that reform movement and influenced the foundation of many monasteries on the Benedictine code. They came to be known as the Benedictines, although it was never established specifically as an order in the same way that Cistercians came to be, an enormous and mighty monastery with huge influence. Then the Cistercians, in the late 11th century, the Cistercians, the monks from Cluny left to try and re-establish the rigidity of the Benedictine order, and they founded their first monastery at Cîteaux. Here, here's Cluny in here, and not far away into the Burgundian forest, and they began to establish the Cistercian order from Cîteaux, and it became a mighty church. And the one of the first four is Clairvaux here, which you can see in the 1708 plan. Clairvaux, a bit further north, became the mother house for the Cistercians of Purawalia, of the Wales of the native princes in the 12th century. The notion of the plan of a monastery like this reflects what we saw at St. Gall, but with the focus on the claustral complex and the buildings in the ranges around it, with the church closing the fourth side, usually the north side, but not always. There is a fundamental division, which I've shown it by this red spiked line, between that part of the monastery, which is in a sense the Holy of Holies. That is that part of the monastery run by the choir monks, the priest monks, with their dormitories set above, and the chapter house in here, with the refectory divided down the middle, and the nave of the church divided between the choir for the choir monks and the lay monks, who were in the western part of the choir, and their accommodation lay on this side. So it's a refinement of Cluny. It's clearly disciplined, and the prescribing of the plan is to be found in early Cistercian documents like the Carta Caritatis, the Charter of Charity, the Charter of Love. In terms of the layout of beyond the core buildings, those fountains and Rivo here are excellent examples. Very important work being done on these Yorkshire monasteries, and I think I saw Stuart Harrison in the audience, and a lot of very important work has been done by him on this and other Cistercian and other monasteries. And just to point out that there are, in a sense, subdivisions of the precinct. There is an inner precinct and an outer precinct, or sometimes they're called an inner court and an outer court, and the same is to be found here in the plan of Rivo. And here you can see these buildings to do with the labor of the monks, rather spread out rather more, as indeed they are in the outer precinct at fountains as well. And I'm going to finish my part of this is that one of the things that really interests me is, as a landscape archaeologist, looking at the context of all of this, is that as we slowly build our understanding through excavation and survey of the monastery and the monastic buildings, one of the things I think that strikes us is that there is variation in the Cistercian reality. Although there's some core principles which can be taken right back to the origins of monasticism, as I hope I've shown you, we are looking from one site to another, looking at quite a great variability. And I'm going to end on this by saying of the right-hand plan there, that is a flight of my fantasy, because I was asked by a computer generating, a man who was generating all our computer imagery, what did the outer precincts look like? And I think the answer is, I really don't know. But he said that's not good enough, and insisted that I populated it. And I populated it to the best of my understanding, with enclosures and buildings and structures and so on, using sites like Rivo, it's documented outer enclosures, for example. But the important thing here to stress is that it is a very, very spread out site when you look at the buildings and the structures, and fills 126 acres of space. And what we're going to do now is to invite you to compare that with what we've been able to discover at Abbey Cwmhir. Now, Julian, it's over to you.
David has shown, I think, the conceptual and physical context in which Abbey Cwmhir, which will be my main focus, was founded and built. The Cistercian monastic tradition. I want to focus on the Abbey and its precinct. And in particular, I want to show the types of information we have considered to gain new insight into what we see today, as in this image here, with that rather gnarled set of walls of the great nave, a mound, which probably was debris when site was cleared in the early 19th century, and off to the left, a lake. But first, I want to give you a very brief history, a very, very brief history of the Abbey. Can't get much briefer than this. 1176, it was founded. In 1400-ish, it was despoiled by Owen Glendower. In 1644, the Abbey was attacked and slighted during the English Civil War. 1536, dissolution of the monasteries. And in the 1820s, the site was converted into a picturesque garden. These are all fairly potentially fairly destructive interventions on the site. And I just want to outline this by giving a couple of quotations, because documentation is one of the lines we have followed. The famous quotation from Leland, 1540, "No church in Wales is seen of such length as the foundation of walls there begun doth show, but the third part of the work was never finished. All the house was spoiled by Owen Glendower." Pretty brief, and a lot of thought has gone into what the third, which was never finished, was and what it actually means. The second quotation from 1644, and we must remember that almost throughout its certainly earlier history, the church, the abbey, was on a fault line between England and Wales. Here we have the comment after the abbey was stormed by the parliamentarians, that the enemy had made them a garrison at Abbey Cwmhir, a very strong house and built with stone of great thickness, and the walls and outworks all very strong. The house has been in the former times an abbey of the papists. This garrison of theirs is Mr. Powler's house, which began to be a great annoyance to us, since which our general, having thrown down the enemy's works, made the garrison unsuitable for the future. A couple of fairly destructive acts taking place there. And then we move to the early 1800s, when the abbey went into the possession of Thomas Wilson. Some years ago, I contracted to have the interior of the rooms cleared to the floor. This was done, and vast quantities of ornamental and other freestone were dug up and preserved, if only preserved. I afterwards had the exterior of the ruins and the whole field in which they stood dug up, and found the abbot's apartments. Well, he dug it all up, but we don't know, because we don't have any maps, what he thought were the abbot's apartments and why he thought that. The other stone I have broken up and used for the roads. Below the ruins, to a considerable extent, I have formed the river into a lake, which adds much to its beauty. Not really very helpful from the archaeological point of view at all. And it has remained more or less like that since that time, for over 200 years. No, just about 200 years. We've looked at early maps. This probably was done in the times of Thomas Wilson. And here at the center, we have the abbey, the home farm, and we have, you'll see, two lines, one for the brook coming along here, and a second line for the Leat serving a mill, and Vulcan's Hall, the smithy. There was no lake at this time. That gives us some insight into what might have been found in the early 1800s. But it wasn't until the 1890s that the first excavations were done. This by Stephen Williams. He measured out the extant ruins, dark here, and he did a number of excavations, partly, I think, occasioned by there having been a drain in the 1890s being taken across this part of the ruins. And it obviously drew attention to some stonework. And here I've shown what he found. This was the division line between the lay people and the choir monks in the main abbey. There was a little part of stonework there, some other stones dug up here and here, and he was able to extend by his excavations the transept, the idea of the transept going out further beyond what is currently visible, both on this side and that side. It's not known whether he stopped at this point for any particular reason or whether there was just nothing else beyond that. But I also want to draw your attention to this angular piece here, which I'll come back to somewhat later. Unfortunately, he made a mistake in the layout, in his hypothetical layout. Here he has a lot of the claustral buildings in this position, whereas normally in the plans that you've just been looking at, they would have appeared down here, added on to the transept. And this, unfortunately, has misled quite a number of later commentators into thinking that they could, this smaller cloister might have been related to an earlier church, and here you see it outlined. This is entirely spurious. There's no evidence at all for this earlier church, and it's based upon this mistaken identity of Williams that the claustral buildings were along here, added in this case to the transept of a smaller church. So that was the commentary after Williams's excavations of the 1890s. And in about 2005, this is a diagram of Clwyd Powys Archaeological Trust, in which you see the abbey, and they followed those suggestions, those hypothetical positioning of the cloister that we have just seen. Quite sketchy, proposed precinct boundary. And what I want to say is that this is based upon the best knowledge at that time. It was followed up by some work, geophysical work, magnetometry. You have the remains of the church here. You have semblance of something square or rectangulish there. Unknown features here. Some element of the cloisters here, possibly, with part of that little section which I pointed out in the excavation diagram. This line is almost certainly the line of the drain, so it can be safely ignored. There's a hedgerow here, and on the other side, they found a lot of reaction from a bank, and here where there'd obviously been some fires. I came on the scene a few years ago and started using photogrammetry to study the area. Here, obviously, we have the church, the mound. There's a pathway down here, quite strong. You can see the long line of the drain discharging into the river. We have some more detail on that square building, as we assume it to be, just in the area where a transept would have been, but this time extending under the hedge. And we have this line coming across here, where there were some very positive reactions. Here, of course, is the lake. Some activity here, but difficult to resolve, difficult to make it out. But that's just in the immediate neighborhood of the building itself, the ruins. When you look at the whole cloister, sorry, the whole precinct, you begin to see the complexity of it. David has commented about the importance of the precinct boundary. And here we have it here. It goes off the chart here, it disappears into the forest. So I couldn't follow it under there using photogrammetry. But you can see the wider context of this area, this precinct area. Lots of ploughing, two different directions here, two different pitches, if that's the right term, for the ploughing, one going east-west, the other north-south, some more ploughing there. Beginning here to spell out a lot of detail within the precinct. Here, of course, is the home farm, modern buildings, modern buildings. And just to can't get my cursor down. There we are. Just to reinforce that, here is the visible precinct boundary, the very prominent one. Here is a line which was confusing for many years, but is now appears to be part of the defense, because we've got a English Civil War defensive situation here, another one defensive situation here, the building, the main ruins, the building, and another ditch across here with the river running through it. Now, the boundary is important, so we use another technique when it comes to looking beneath the trees. This is kind of an unfamiliar view, but here again we have the ruins at the center, the precinct boundary coming along here, disappearing under trees, continuing around here, around here, around here. We're kind of losing it in this area, but it probably returned back along there and crossed to join up again. So we're getting a fuller idea of the precinct, the totality of what was the Abbey. Slightly different view, a different way of analyzing the data, but you can see the self-same features, the precinct boundary, where the church is in the middle, and so on. It's by looking at a number of these that we've been able to put together the likely boundary. This is an oblique view, again using LiDAR, which can penetrate trees, but I wasn't using it to penetrate trees here. I wanted just to show how, again, the boundary came down here, ran along here, and probably curved around the smithy and the mill itself. There's a leat here coming from the pond. Here we have the Abbey ruins. So we're beginning to use a range of different techniques and information to flesh out what was happening on this site. The next big step forward was taken using this photograph, oblique photograph of the site, taken by Toby Driver for the Royal Commission in the very dry period, very dry summer of 2018. And I think it's immediately apparent that we've got some very interesting parch marks here, where you'd typically, in the area you'd expect a cloister. I manipulated this image. I'm not quite sure I like the word manipulated in this context. It sounds as though I'm cooking the books. But what I mean is I rectified it so as to make it a proper plan view. And I adjusted color levels in turning it into a black and white image to bring out the details, not otherwise apparent, of the parch marks. And here we have almost like a ghost of the buildings beginning to emerge. We don't understand all of it by any means, but we've got some very clear features. First of all, the cloister and the claustral buildings around here. I'll go into a little bit more detail in a minute. We have some features in this area, which probably relate to the house that we were looking at before. We have a nice path coming down here, modern. Once again, we have the drain going across there to the river. And within the Abbey itself, we have these curved paths related to it being used as a romantic garden, a picturesque ruin within the garden. There's a lot of detail here to consider. And I just focus in on the main area here. It's quite clear that we've got these structures here. I told you to remember from Williams's diagram that little Z-shaped feature. That's it there, showing up in the parch marks. This is verification, in my mind, that what we're looking at in these parch marks are subsurface remains of buildings or walls, foundations. You may just about be able to make out that there does seem to be an extension of the wall there, of this south transept wall. One of the questions which very naturally arises when looking at the this cloister area is it just foundations in the terms of lay length? Was this third never finished? Well, this little V on its side mark may be crucial in that interpretation, or in the interpretation of that, on answering that question. This appears to be a bastion built onto the side of extant walls in the 1644 fortification of this Abbey garrison. This would enable soldiers to fight at the side of anyone attacking along this line, and of course coming across here. It strengthens a corner, and corners are always weak points. Very clear from normal castle design. Over here, we've got something interesting. This bright line here is a more recent trackway going up to the farm, to the home farm. But can you see the ghost of a square there? And another square there? And possibly even another square going up here. These appear to be the remnants of building structures which are showing through in the parch marks. They've never been recorded prior to this. So here you see, by using a range of techniques, we're really beginning to come to terms with not only the precinct boundary, with possibly an inner and an outer area, but also with the building structures of the abbey itself and how it fitted into the standard patterns, the Cistercian or Benedictine model of how an abbey should be. I should say that we would naturally expect there to be a building here, which would be the chapter house. This area is a damper area, a circular damper area, where parch marks didn't persist, didn't arise. And we're just on the edge here of the lake. And so this area is also likely to be damper. It's also likely to have had debris thrown on it from the lake when the lake has been periodically cleaned. So we're gaining quite a lot of information here. And from that, we begin to pick out a number of features. This diagram is taken from the paper which has been submitted to Archaeologia Cambrensis. And here you see that we've got the possibility of a boundary bank here, and with working areas out here. This farm is actually noted or referred to on the tithe maps. The mill area, so this is a kind of working area outside, maybe this is the outer precinct, inner precinct here, and another outer precinct at this end, with the hypothetical at this point line of the precinct coming across some of the modern buildings and the modern town there and being completed. There are other diagrams which we have which disentangle other periods. from the overall site. But I'd finally just like to come back to this diagram. We're used to being told that the aspirations of the Abbey builders was huge. This is the longest nave in Wales and amongst the longest in the whole of the UK. I thought it interesting to show it in relation to Strata Florida. And so from one of my photographs over Strata Florida, to the same scale, I have superimposed Strata Florida. Here, you have the outer walls of Strata Florida nave coming down here, across, and just quickly outlining Strata Florida there and returns along there. The nave is around 42 meters long. Abbey Cwmhir is 75 meters long, extending way out here. And whereas in the parch marks, we have that little space just here, and that's curious bit of foundation work from Stephen Williams. Here you can see how it makes sense by having a separate little room there before you come onto the cloister. And you have the cholesterol buildings down here, the chapter house. And here we have the cloister of Strata Florida, which would come down here and join. So the whole scale of this church was awesome for its period. And one thing I only noticed when I superimposed these two images is, and I don't know whether it's clear on your images, but just take a glance at the thickness of the walls here for Abbey Cwmhir compared with the thickness of these outer walls here for Strata Florida. These are very much stronger, presumably because they were holding up this larger building with a larger roof, all of which had to be supported, and the strains taken over the weight above, which would typically tend to spread out, to force outwards the wall, so they had to be strong. Just fade that image of Strata Florida out now, but I hope that that helps illustrate the whole scale of the aspirations of the Abbey Cwmhir builders. I think I'll stop at that point, so thank you very much for your attention.